Hey everybody, Hoosier Jedi here with another review for you. This time I'm talking about episode 18 of season 1 of Green Lantern, the animated series called Prisoner of Sinestro. Overall, this doesn't really strike me as being the strongest of episodes. It's simply because overall the plot, the story of the episode is kind of weak. This episode is really just there to introduce us to Sinestro and give us an idea of what kind of a guy he is. And overall, I think that it does that. But apart from the characterization of Sinestro and to some degree the Aya Razor relationship, everything else in this episode just seems kind of just there. It's really kind of flat. But let's get into it, and let's start by talking about one of the episode's positive points. There's a mention of a race called the Khund. Now, these are aliens who are mentioned fairly regularly in the Green Lantern and overall DC Universe comics. They're basically a well-known race of space baddies. Never really, to the best of my knowledge, just sort of presented as a major threat. They're really just sort of the generic thug alien race, I suppose, is really the best way to put it. So, since I've mentioned already, let's just kind of get right into what's going on with the Aya Razor romance, and of course this continues to be very weird, incredibly awkward, and neither of them really knows how to deal with this. Aya, of course, because she's a machine, she's never really dealt a whole lot with other beings, and she's still very new to the idea of emotions. Razor, of course, is having to deal with the whole idea of, could he possibly deal with having a second love? And there's this, of course, also the fact that Aya is a machine and he is an organic being. And as I said in my last review, I still think Razor doesn't really quite understand just how much of a sentient being Aya is. Obviously, he cares about her. I think he acknowledges her as a sentient being, but I think really the question is his mind is how much of what he feels could she possibly return? And this isn't a knock against Aya. It is simply uncertainty on Razor's part. And if you think about the situation from his perspective, I mean, he's basically in love with a machine, with a robot, with the AI of a spaceship. There really isn't a dating guide for that kind of thing. He's having to completely grope in the dark for how to deal with this situation, so it's really no wonder that he stumbles. And I do have to admit, the scene where the possessed Razor was kind of flirting with Aya / trying to figure out whether or not he could possess her was pretty hilarious, just for Aya's sheer awkwardness and confusion. But of course, this all turns into a rather sort of bitter situation once it's all resolved, and I kind of got a glimpse of what she would really like to see from Razor, but that he may or may not be capable of giving to her, which of course only makes the whole situation worse. And honestly, Hal's mention of hormones, which is let's be honest here, hormones is simply a kid show friendly stand-in for the word sex. And not that I didn't think that was funny to some degree. It just it just felt a little awkward. Let me see here. Now, the alien that Sinestro brings aboard, I didn't really bother to see whether or not he's an established character. I think he might be. The name did sound vaguely familiar, but ultimately the alien prisoner is really just meant there to be Deus Ex Machina. And what he ultimately does with this whole body possession thing is amazingly extremely reminiscent of the old classic horror film made by John Carpenter called The Thing. I believe that came out in like 1980, 1981. There was actually an episode of The X-Files called Ice, one of my favorite episodes of the entire series, as a matter of fact, that was very much a riff on The Thing. And here we see it to a lesser degree in this episode. And incidentally, if you've not seen The Thing, it's certainly an older movie, but it's still really, really good. And we get the usual standard test. We get to see our characters, doing evil stuff while possessed. We get to see the question of, okay, let's prove who isn't possessed by the alien and who isn't. And I have to admit, the whole situation that Sinestro comes up, the whole solution that Sinestro comes up with, is actually really extremely clever. I was really worried that they were just going to have to get in the ship and like, okay, let's go back to Oa and let the Guardians sort all this out. But no. And coming up with that solution on his own really goes a long way, just establishing Sinestro's credibility as a very formidable Green Lantern. This is a case of show, not tell. Not that we didn't have plenty to tell. Hal, at the very earlier part of this episode, is really talking Sinestro up. And of course, Kilowog is presented as having some serious criticisms of Sinestro, but the way we're presented with in the early part of the episode leads us to think that it really might not be so much that Sinestro is a flawed person so much as he's just somebody from the Hal Jordan school of being a Green Lantern, and naturally Kilowog does not 100% subscribe to that. But Sinestro engineering the death of that prisoner, it of course shows us that Sinestro is, he may be a good guy, but he is certainly not a nice person. He is a person who can be extraordinarily ruthless. As TV tropes put it, good is not nice. And not to mention someone who is not above taking the decision of life and death into his own hands. Now, one of the big things about the Green Lantern ring is that for years and years, for decades even in the comics, Green Lantern rings really could not be used in a lethal fashion. It takes really extraordinary circumstances for the Guardians to be willing to basically take the safeties off and make a Green Lantern ring a potentially lethal weapon. Now, I'm going to assume that situation is still in play here, and thus this is why Sinestro goes through all the trouble of rigging it to look like something that could plausibly be an accident. Now, of course, Sinestro doesn't want to get in trouble for taking justice into his own hands. Sinestro's way too smart of a guy to do all that. But again, it's all these little things that really come together and give us a very, very telling portrait of what kind of a guy Sinestro is. And if you're familiar with the Green Lantern movie, or well, to some degree, or the Green Lantern comics at all, hey, spoiler, Sinestro eventually kind of goes bad. Hey, what a shock. A guy with a name like Sinestro going bad? But anyway, this is one more tile in the mosaic of building towards possibly seeing the War of Light. Of course, and again, I'm going to give a little bit of a spoiler here, but it's not a shock at all for people who know the comics. The Sinestro Corps is ultimately the guys who are the representatives of the yellow energy, of the emotion of fear. And Sinestro is somebody who can be somebody who you would most definitely fear. I mean, he even goes and sort of specifically taunts his victim. Really, I mean, this is a guy who could pretty easily inspire great fear. Now, when we will see Sinestro go bad, and I think it's pretty safe to say at this point it's an inevitability. Well, I don't think that's going to happen right away. Obviously, you don't want to introduce a guy and then the next episode he just turns around and becomes a bad guy. That's really not going to have much of an emotional payoff. But I can see Sinestro sort of playing a larger role in dealing with the Manhunters, and that in some way pushing his character into eventually becoming the villain for which he is most well known for being. Now, of course, Sinestro is played by the one and only Ron Perlman. Ron Perlman is a guy with just an absolutely incredible resume as a voice actor, like Clayface on Batman the Animated Series back in the 90s for DC. More recently, he was Slade, aka Deathstroke, on the Teen Titans cartoon from several years back. He's done a lot of other things, like the voice of the narrator in Fallout 3. If you remember the old Beauty and the Beast TV series, he was the Beast. I mean, the guy just has just a great resume. Oh yeah, he's also Hellboy. Who could forget that? So, we certainly have no complaints as to who. I certainly have no complaints as to who they got to play Sinestro. He delivers an absolutely great performance. He certainly conveys the menacing side of Sinestro extraordinarily well. But menacing villains are a Ron Perlman specialty, so I really don't think any of us should be surprised by that. And with that, folks, that's all I really have to say for right now. Again, not the hugest. This episode was a little lacking in crunch. Let's put it that way. But still, we're introduced to someone who is an extraordinarily important person in the Green Lantern mythos. They've got a fantastic actor providing the voice for him. So, more good things are just in store for us. I'm sure of it. And with that said, folks, we're going to wrap it up here. As always, please comment, rate, and subscribe. And of course, you can follow me on Twitter at Hoosier Jedi. Until next time, take care and have a good one.